we're going to kind of move to next. And I think the best way to kind of illustrate this pattern of questioning is by looking at another case and then comparing the two. So we're going to look at Ms. Chong's classroom. And this is pages 15 to 16. So and this is two pieces of student work from Ms. Chong's classroom, Gabe and another student. Fascinating work, especially Gabe's. And these two teachers are in the same school. Typical scenario, right? Oh, the caterpillar, yeah, let's make that into a math lesson. Let's have the kids, use blocks, and let's make sure they all draw pictures, right? So you teachers were co-planning, kind of came up with the same format for how to present the task and engage students in the task. But they really didn't talk about, in retrospect, about how to facilitate a whole class discussion of that work. So Ms. Chong's classroom conversation was actually a little different than Ms. Richard's. So what I'd like you to do now is to read Ms. Chong's class discussion. Again, think about what types of questions did Ms. Chong ask out of those 4 types, or engage as well. And then start to focus more so on the interaction patterns. And how is Ms. Chong's different than Ms. Richard's? And then perhaps you'll also have a little time to start talking about what differences do those interaction patterns make or affect student learning. What's the outcome for student learning in Ms. Richard's classroom, and what might be the outcome for student learning in Ms. Chong's? All right? I know, you're curious now, you want to read it. So take a couple minutes to read the case, and then again, start to have a small group conversation about it. So perhaps about 3-4 minutes total. Let's see. Which classroom do you think student learning is a bit deeper and richer? Ms. Richard or Ms. Chong? Yeah. So at first when we read Ms. Richard, it's like, oh, nice conversation. But by contrasting it with Ms. Chong, you start to go, wait a minute, Ms. Richard's was not a little bit better, it was a lot better. One group I stopped at, they said, wow, like Ms. Chong just kind of asked individual student questions, didn't really engage students with each other's thinking, but kind of had a place where she wanted to get them. So to kind of wrap this up, and then I'm going to turn this back over to Steve. I think Ms. Chong's questions, this is how I categorized them. In that line 8, I wasn't quite sure. Does everyone understand what Sophia figured out the answer was 15? She asked it, but I don't know if she really even looked, or didn't probe. I think it was just kind of like, I asked it, and a couple of heads nodded, and moved on. But her questions really were more at that assessing, right? It was asking, gathering information questions and probing a little bit. Whereas Ms. Richard's were much more around that advancing, took kids a bit further into that thinking. And as Peg writes about assessing and advancing questions, she said, usually we begin with an assessing question because we got to find out how the student's thinking or the class is thinking. But then we need to ask an advancing question to kind of press and push them further in their learning. Whereas Ms. Chong was kind of like assessing, getting at some of that thinking, but not pushing them further. So in describing those two interaction patterns, one would be characterized as focusing and one as funneling. Okay, so I don't know if you've heard those 2 words before. You can kind of guess which one's which, right? So in Principles to Action, it's on page 37 that you can just make a note that you might want to go and read through those paragraphs when you have time. But I'm going to summarize them here, and I put them on handout near page 17 if you've noticed that yet. So think about the characteristics of funneling, and then think of the 2 teachers. So in funneling, the teacher kind of leads students to perhaps the teacher-desired procedure or conclusion. It kind of seemed like Ms. Chung wanted those students to work on counting on. So I'm going to get them all to practice counting on. and didn't really even listen to the other kids. She asked Gabe kind of how he got his answer, but she really kind of ignored it and then went on to the coming on. Didn't push Gabe, because it kind of, Gabe's thinking was not like my thinking. And I know this is hard, right? Because this is where the unsureness sometimes comes in our teaching, that, wow, I have to listen to Gabe, think about what he did, and then how do I engage the other kids in his thinking? I mean, we know that's not easy work. So Ms. Chung would be characterized as funneling. Whereas in focusing, it's really eliciting, using, and building on students' thinking. And it's that building on which characterizes it. You know, in a focusing conversation, we expect students to communicate and reflect on not only their ideas, but those of their classmates. That's where you see many more of those engaging questions going on. And then finally, you know, those questions are to guide students towards deeper understanding and relationships of the mathematics. So, I'm going to wrap this up real quickly. In your handout, I'm not going to ask you to read it, but you do have the teacher and student action tables about questioning. So that's something for your reference to think about. Which one would you prioritize, perhaps, for your own practice, or prioritize to take back to your school and have a conversation with? But as I think about my call to action for you around questioning, it's really, I think if we took a bit more time to think about preparing those advancing questions, we would be more ready to have that conversation with our kids that would press their knowledge further. So some of the key messages to wrap this up, as I think about this afternoon, to develop students' representational competence. Walk out of here saying, okay, how am I going to take steps to start to develop their competence using representations and making those connections? How am I as a teacher going to make sure I press students to connect those representations, whether if it's in small groups, whole class discussion, or there was one table was talking about how to make their assessments get more at assessing those connections. In questions, the need to ask more advancing questions. And then finally, to think, am I really funneling my students into how I want them to think about this math idea? Or am I open to building on their thinking, knowing we do have this math goal in mind, but how am I going to focus and engage them with that thinking of each other to focus them on the math idea so that they can have ownership of it themselves? All right, so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Steve.